But sometimes, if it's something that's from a little bit more of an obscure author that gets recommended to me and I'm not really familiar with it and I know it's not going to sell itself, then yeah, I will definitely read it because I am going to want to know firsthand before I go recommending those books.
Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I geek out about the stories we are passionate about in all different genres, styles, and formats. And we'll give a few recommendations to you, our listeners. Beware, possible spoilers ahead. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and I started this podcast during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I watched the reaction of my social media circle, I noticed that many people turned to stories for comfort and help in making sense of the craziness going on around them. And as all good stories do, the world got even crazier. But, as Neil Gaiman says, fairy tales are more than true not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Since I believe that stories have the power to show us the way and give us courage to keep going, I wanted to see if that was true for my guests as well. Hello, today we are recording episode number 16, and today my guest is Roxanna McGinnis, the owner of Get Lit, an independent bookstore in Sierra Vista, Arizona. In fact, it's the only bookstore in Sierra Vista, Arizona. And that's how Roxanna and I met, was at the bookstore. Welcome to the show, Roxanna.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so excited too, because I have fantasies sometimes of working in a library or working in a bookstore. And so I wanted you to tell a little bit about what it's like to really own a bookstore.
Well, it's a lot like owning any other kind of business, only with books. And by that, I mean that there is budgeting and ordering and all of that really boring business end of the stuff that takes up most of your time. So yeah, the books are a nice perk. If you're going to be in business, why not be in business with something that you love? But what you see on the surface it's funny because I belong to a social media group for bookstore owners and managers, and somebody commented on there, what was the name of the movie with Meg Ryan where she owned a bookstore, the little bookstore around the corner.
Oh, yeah, it's based on the little bookstore around the corner,
Yeah, I think, anyway, somebody had just been watching that, and there was a scene in there that basically somebody walked in and they were all sitting around the bookstore reading, all the people who worked there. And it was this big joke because everybody thinks that we just sit around and read, and we actually, when you're owning a bookstore, you have less time to read than you do before you owned a bookstore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be the way it is for any business owner who has a brick and mortar kind of store. Mm-hmm. My husband has a business on the side, but he only, people just call him up when they need help with their computer problems or if they need graphic arts done or something.
Right.
It's not the same kind of business. I was thinking of, there's an older movie that I think that one is based on, the one with Meg Ryan, and her aunt is sitting up on top of a little ladder and she's reading, and someone comes in the door and she says, "Just browse around," as she's reading. And it happens to be her niece, and she says, "Auntie, you can't be reading the books all the time. You have to pay attention." It's really funny.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the nice thing is, in everything I do, I get to hear about books, because in all the ordering you've got to figure out what's new,
Yes.
It's so much fun because even I've spent my whole life, I just love being around books, even when I'm not reading them, and it just relaxes me. So there is something fun to me anyway. I might be odd in this aspect, but to me, I just enjoy looking at books online, reading about books online, looking at catalogs of books, talking about books. It all works.
Yes, well, and maybe that feeds into the next question that I had
Mhm.
was, do you have to read a lot of books or so that you can recommend them, or do you just recommend them based on what you've read about the new books coming out, or
A, a little of each. If it's a big title that everybody's talking about,
Mhm.
that's on the bestseller list that's out there, those sell themselves. So those are actually some of the books that I'm least likely to read right now because I don't necessarily have to. And a lot of times, especially the big name authors and things like that, I can usually tell by reading about them. Or if it's something that's a genre that I just really don't get into, and I think I may not appreciate this because it's just not my genre, then I recommend based on reviews and all kinds of sources for reviews from other booksellers, reviews from insiders that everybody else may not know about. So we get a lot of information that way. I go a lot by friends. I have a number of friends that hey, have you read such and such, and find out from them. But sometimes if it's something that's from a little bit more of an obscure author that gets recommended to me and I'm not really familiar with it and I know it's not going to sell itself, then yeah, I will definitely read it because I am going to want to know firsthand before I go recommending those books.
Yes. Yeah, I tend to be somebody, I don't like the new and shiny normally.
Yeah.
I like to read books. Well, I read a lot of classic literature, but I really like to read books that have been around for about 5 years and lots of people still are talking about and like.
Mm-hmm.
And I do try to search out books by people that are not the number one
Right.
bestseller people,
Yeah.
I don't, maybe it's wrong of me, but I kind of have a little bit of a prejudice against those people. I don't know why.
I know what you mean. There are some writers that I think almost write too much, and I'm not going to mention any names, but there are some that maybe I enjoyed once upon a time, and then 87 books later, I gave up a long time ago.
Yes. I mean, there are certain, now I do have certain authors that I've read the whole series of their
Mm-hmm.
books, like Naomi Novik's His Majesty's Dragon Temeraire
Right.
series. I've read all of
Mm-hmm.
those. But then she stopped writing those and she went on to different genre.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And 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 then there are I read all 21 of the Cadfile books by Ellis Peters because I saw the mini series when it
Yeah.
was on Masterpiece Mystery years
Mm-hmm.
ago. And then one year I just decided to get all the books and read them. And I read them all in order, and that was fun. And then I have another one that I really love. Her name is Octavia Randolph, that I mention a lot on here.
Right. Okay.
And so she's still, but I'm not bored with her series. I hate to say this, but I did get bored with Outlander.
Mm.
I read 4 books and then it was like, okay, I'm kind of done with
I
for a while.
I have to say that I got bored with the TV series, and I watched the TV series before tackling the books, and I only read the first book. I'm going to admit it's My husband discovered it for me, and he said, "Oh, you'll love the show." And I kind of did. I mean, in theory, I should. It's everything that I love. I love the
Mm-hmm.
historical stuff. I love,
Mm-hmm.
Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
the British Isles, all that. But I don't know. It kind of lost me halfway through the first season.
I watched the first 2 seasons, I think.
Yeah, I
And
think,
then
yeah.
I was done.
Yeah, that was kind of, yeah, it wasn't really for me. But, a lot of people love it, and that's great. So,
Oh yes. Well, and I have not seen or read anything Game of Thrones. So I don't know what it is about that one. Someone when I was working at I was teaching on Post at the college. I was teaching a class
mhm.
on Post. And one of the tutors had an office in the building where we taught our classes. And one day I was talking to him and he was reading the first of the Game of Thrones series. And
Mhm.
he was enthralled by it. And he was describing it to me. And I was like, that doesn't sound fun at all. All the people getting killed off and all the political stuff. I'm not into political stuff.
Yeah, and I have held off on that too. I haven't read or watched either. I want to.
Mm-hmm.
It was one that I felt like, well, it's sort of been on my list, and then 2020 hit, and it wasn't anything I wanted to tackle in 2020. I needed lighter stuff.
Yes.
So it'll be a few years.
Yes, probably. I mean, I may pick it up at some point because one of my niece and I were talking about The Hate You Give. We were also talking about this other series called The Children of Blood and Bone. And we'd read,
yes.
we'd read the first, well, we were both almost finished with the second book when we just went, we can't read it because of the way things were going in the country.
Yes. I haven't read the second book yet. I've only read the first.
Yeah. Well, I think that author is writing a third book, and I will go back and finish that series because I want to find out what happens.
Yes. And I want to finish it too. She's written all three now.
She has. The third one's come out?
I'm pretty sure it's out. Because I think I have it in my store. Yes, I have it in my, yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's out. So.
Yes. Yeah. I hate to say this, but I buy most of my books, ebooks now, because almost every single room in our house has bookshelves full of books, and I don't have any more room. Although I did get 4 books for Christmas, 4 physical books, and it was like, where am I going to put these? I don't have room for them. And they're big books. Well, actually, I bought Eleanor for myself. I'm reading the biography of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, how fun.
But the other books 2 of them are fiction, and one of them is the book, How the South Won the Civil War.
Okay.
It's a political book, I know, but it just seemed like, I think I need to read this.
Yeah, but that was a while ago. It's not really contemporary politics.
No, but she is talking about, Heather Cox Richardson is talking about how the Southern politicians have kind of created the situation that we're in now over the years. And so she's a historian.
Okay.
And so my sister read, and brother-in-law read the book out loud to each other. And my sister's always saying, oh my gosh, this thing we're experiencing now, it's from the, I have to read it. Yeah, but I'm with you. I read a nonfiction book and then maybe a fiction book, which is what I'm doing now. The book about Eleanor Roosevelt is almost 750 pages, and the type is really small.
Oh boy, yeah.
So it's going to take me a while to read it. And I just read a little bit at a time. It's fascinating. Her parents were both dead by the time she was 10, but they didn't treat her very well in any way. So, I mean, her father was an alcoholic. He treated her well, but he was an alcoholic, which was not good. Yeah. So, so that's fascinating. I haven't opened the other books to see what their type size is. I'm a little older now, so it's a little hard sometimes to read that small type.
Oh, tell me about it. That's where e-readers can be nice because you just zoom, you just change it to font size.
Oh yeah. Well, that's what I love about having the iPad now is because I can make the font size larger. I can make it gray or black in the background with white letters instead of the other way. And it's easier on my eyes. And yeah. Well, I was wondering if you had any favorite. Oh, no, first I want to know, when did you get hooked on stories? Did you start reading early?
I don't think I started reading early, but I was always read to. My parents definitely believed in reading to me. I had 2 older siblings, and they were 9 and 11 when I was born, so they read to me. Oh. My grandparents read to me. I was spoiled and read to in that way. So yes, so I think I loved stories. I can't remember ever not loving stories. There was a time when I was probably 2.5, probably not even 3. Well, I might have been 3. And we had tons of the little golden books. Remember those? Uh-huh. We just had tons and tons and tons of those. And my favorite one was called, well, I don't know, it was my very favorite. I really liked Mother Hubbard too. But anyway, and the Pokey Little Puppy. But there was one called The Little Mommy. And it was about this little girl and her 3 dolls. And she was, and it was funny because I had somehow memorized that book, and I knew exactly when to turn the pages. I couldn't read a single word. I didn't know any of my letters, but it was really funny because my dad would sit me on his knee and I would read this book, and we'd have people over and they'd be like, wow, your daughter's reading? She's barely 3. I just had it memorized.
I love that though.
Kind of the joke. Still remember the first line. I am the mommy and these are my babies, Annabelle, Betsy, and Bonnie. Anyway, it was funny.
Those are great.
Yes, I always loved stories. From the time I started reading, which was probably, kindergarten, first grade, like normal, my mom would always take me to the library in the summer. They always had a summer reading program at the library. We lived in a tiny little town in Montana, and we'd go to the library and I'd go in there and pick out books. The first ones I remember getting hooked on was a series of stories about like early reader, not quite chapter books, Raggedy Ann and Andy. And there was a whole series of them. And I'd go in there and I'd, look for one that I hadn't read yet. And it was so exciting. And from there, I moved into like the Little House on the Prairie books.
Oh, yes.
That was a big one for me because about the time that I was reading the books, when I first started reading the books, was about the time that the TV series launched.
Oh.
And so it was huge. I mean, everybody was, all of us who had moms who were begging for a prairie dress and a bonnet, and,
right.
and we would read the books in school. I think it was my second grade teacher, when we would do story time and she'd read us a chapter a day in a chapter book. And I think she is the one who read us Little House in the Big Woods, and that got me hooked.
Oh, yeah.
And then my best friends and I would go out at recess and we would play Little House on the Prairie, and we would act out the stories. I mean, do kids do that anymore? I don't know. I always had to play Mary because I was the blonde, and I wore glasses, so I was always Mary. And then my friends were brunettes, so they got to, and one of them was really short. So she always had to be the little one, Carrie, and didn't like that. But anyway. So, but we would do that. And that was, I had this major obsession with Little House on the Prairie. I begged for a canopy bed. Eventually I got a canopy bed, and it was the covered wagon. I mean, it was.
Oh, yes. I can see that.
I really got into that. Historical. It was just so other world,
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I remember there was probably a little earlier than this, there was a book that our teacher had read to us called 7 Alone. And it later became a movie. And it's the first movie I remember going to in the theater.
I remember that movie.
You remember it's about a family of 7 children
Mm-hmm.
and the parents who go out on the Oregon Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to go to Oregon, and then both parents die on the way. And the oldest son is a teenager, probably late teens, and they go it on their own. And I just remember, it was such a tragic story, but I was so proud of these kids, and they were so amazing. And that was a little obsessed. So I was obsessed with everything pioneer for a while in my early days.
Yeah. Well, I kind of was too. And maybe you can relate to this because a lot of my family, I think on my dad's side and my mom's side, I had family members who went on the Oregon Trail in the 1840s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Little House on the Prairie, my dad's mom actually grew up in the northern Midwest. So that was like, when I read those books, it was like, oh, my grandmother grew up in, places like this.
Yeah. Yeah. See, and I had one of my grandmothers grew up in Oregon, like Oregon, Washington, Northern California coast, and so I think it was her grandparents had come out there, and possibly one of her parents, when they were very, very young, had made that trip from Missouri, I think. But I didn't know about that much detail until much later on. But
yes,
it was just a sense of adventure that I just loved, and then from there, I think I just, those summer trips to the library. And I think from there I went into like Nancy Drew, and I read everything in that series, and that got me hooked on mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I think that morphed into, when I was a teenager and young adult, I was obsessed with Agatha Christie. And there was a time, I was probably 10 or 12 years old when our little town got their first bookstore. And it started in what was almost like a closet of the Hallmark store. and it was just tiny, and they had used books and you could trade them. And I remember, I'd go in and swap books. And then through high school, I swear I was in that store 3 or 4 times a week, because I had to my goal was to collect everything Agatha Christie had ever written.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I finally accomplished that goal before I moved here, and then I had to get rid of so much stuff when I moved.
Oh, man, you had to get rid of all of your Agatha Christie books?
I did. I'd read them all, and I just really wasn't into that so much anymore, so I just gave them all away.
Well, I have a collection of almost all of Louis L'Amour.
Oh, yes. That was another one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not a big Western fan. Sometimes if I just don't know what to read, I'll just pick up one. But my mom and dad had some friends when they lived in Quartzsite, and they had this friend who collected they're all paperbacks. But when he died, his wife didn't know what to do with the books. And my mom said, oh, well, my daughter really likes Louis L'Amour. So she gave them to her, and she gave them to me. So there are a couple of his books that are not Westerns. I'm looking at one right now, and it's The Last of His Breed, which is a Cold War Native American pilot who crashes or gets shot down in Russia. Mm-hmm. And they send him to Siberia, and they don't realize that he's Native American and has figured out how to survive. I think he probably is from someplace like Montana or someplace like that where it's really cold. And he escapes across the strait to Alaska.
Okay.
He evades them, and it's dead winter, but he can survive. And so he does get some help from some people eventually when he gets close to the straits. But that one's good. And then there's another one called The Walking Drum, and it's about, what was it called? The Silk Road, the trade between the Middle East and Europe.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one.
I think that's and it talks a lot about the science and mathematical advances of the Islamic people. Mm-hmm. And that one's really fascinating too. So
I think he wrote a few detective novels too.
Oh, he probably did. I'm not sure I have those.
Yeah, I think I have at least one in my store.
Oh, wow.
But yeah. So he's written everything. And my dad was a big fan, and it'd be the same thing. Westerns weren't really my thing, but when I was really bored, maybe I'm homesick from school or something, and I just go to my dad's bookshelf and this looks good. And I always enjoyed them.
Well, and the Westerns are really short. I mean, you can read them in a couple of days. Well, I'm not a fast reader, but you can read them in a couple of days.
Yeah. Some of them in an afternoon if you're homesick.
Yes, that's true. So, and the thing that I like about his writing is he describes things in such a spare way, but you can see it. Like, I remember the very first thing that I read was when I was doing a long-term sub-assignment. This was shortly after we moved here. So it was like 20 years ago. This year we'll have lived here 25 years. And I was teaching this. It was an alternative school. So I had to teach math and science and all the subjects. Well, one of the stories in the book was The Gift of Cochise.
Okay.
By Louis L'Amour. And it takes place right here where we live. And the descriptions of the landscape. Now, I used to read James Michener. His descriptions go on for pages and pages and pages. It wasn't like that at all with Louis L'Amour. He would say it in maybe a paragraph, and and I could get the picture. I got the picture. I could see it. So once I read that story, that's kind of when I said, oh, I think I might want to read some more of his. And that story got converted into the movie Hondo with John Wayne.
Okay.
It's the same story. It's just they changed the character names Instead of Cochise, his name is something else. And yeah, but that story was it hooked me because his descriptions of the people are so spare, but you get it. You get their emotions. You get what they look like. And I don't write like that. I'm verbose like James Michener, unfortunately. I have to go edit everything.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of appreciation for writers who can be spare like that, sparse.
I know. Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, Agatha Christie's like that, too.
She is. Mm-hmm. And her books are short, too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are. So I just recently started reading, the very first, I did get this one. It was an ebook, though. I got this one for Christmas. It's Inspector Gamache by...
it's not Louise Penny, is it? No.
Yes, it is. Louise Penny.
It is Louise Penny. Yes, because it was,
And I had never heard of her until I listened to What Should I Read Next, which is strictly about books. And Bogle loves Louise Penny. Well, I had never heard of her before. Mm-hmm. So I finally, after several times of hearing people talk about her books, I said, well, maybe I should check it out because I do like mysteries occasionally. I have read Anne Perry. I haven't read all of her books. I got it for Christmas and I read the first one and I liked it. So at some point I'll probably go pick up more of them,
Yeah, she's good. Have you read any of Tana French?
No, I haven't. And
she's my current favorite mystery writer.
Yeah, Beth Orozco, my first guest this year, who works at the college, loves her. And so I have her on my list also to check out.
Yeah. And she's another one that her writing is, she doesn't get too verbose. She can write, and I've seen, because I haven't read everything she's written, but I've read a few of her early books. And then one of her she's got a brand new one out right now, but I read the one before that, The Witch Elm, which was very good. And you can see how her writing has sort of evolved and gotten better. Mm-hmm. But she can write a scene through primarily dialogue and a little bit of description, and you feel like you are right there. And I just love that.
Yes. Well, actually, when I wrote my first novel, I'm working on my second one, which is a sequel. But that's how I started because my background is theater, so I wrote the dialogue first.
Oh yeah. Then I think you'd like Tana French. The Witch Elm starts like that. It starts with these three young men in an Irish pub, and I mean, you just feel like you are there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, and, I teach acting at the college and dramatic structures, the other class that I teach. And, when you watch a movie, you have to pay attention to the lines because the lines are what give you the body language and facial expressions and tone of voice also give you. But if you want background information, you have to listen to the lines because that's where they give you little tidbits about their background or something. So, and I have some college friends one of them is an independent filmmaker, but the other one's a playwright. And he was one of my guests last year, Randy Murray. And, it's a spare kind of writing. Mm-hmm. And even though I took a couple of playwriting classes when I was getting my master's in theater, I loved the whole idea of being in control of the story, but I wasn't sure that I could do the spare writing of Maybe I'll have to try it again.
Yeah. Read some Tana French for inspiration.
Yes. That's a good idea. Oh, good idea. I will. When I wrote my first novel, I wrote the dialogue and then I went back and said, okay, now I'm visualizing what are the facial expressions and body language. And I tried to add that in there.
Yeah. That is so hard to do in writing, is to have to think that up. The words are easy to think up. All the other, I don't know. When I write, I struggle with that.
Well, and my degrees are in theater and religious studies and education. So, I don't have a creative writing degree. I have no idea. They probably give you all these tips about how to.
Well, I took a lot of those classes in college, and Surprisingly not. It was mostly just workshopping. It just seems like you kind of got whatever tips you got out of reading everybody else's work and talking about it.
Well, and maybe that's just the way it is. If you read a lot of books, you're seeing lots of different styles.
And I think that's it. It surprises me when I meet people who claim to be writers, but they don't read. I just don't understand. I don't know how you can, I don't know. It makes no sense to me.
Oh, really?
You could be successful if you don't read.
Yeah. I don't understand that either. Well, I mean, if you're writing a blog or something, that's
right. No, these are people that want to write stories, novels, and yet they'd say, well, I don't really read. Just write.
Oh man, I can't imagine. Because sometimes when I'm reading a novel, I will go, oh, and then I get an idea for my book.
Yes.
My second book, I started it in 2014 when I finished the first one. And it has two timelines. So one timeline, the woman in the past is the 3 times great grandmother of the one in the present.
Okay.
She goes on the Oregon Trail from Vermont to Oregon to be a teacher.
Oh, wow.
Well, that part was easy to write because, the history's already there. And I had her living in Jacksonville, which was the largest city in Oregon in the mid 1800s. And it was a mining, there was mining in that area. And so that's why it was booming. And it was, I did some research, and it was the first city in Oregon that had a Chinatown. And so I included that. Well, that part was easy, but the part in the present wasn't as easy. And so then when I started in 2014, I wanted Morgan in the past to get involved in the suffrage movement.
Okay.
But in 2014, there was no matching thing going on with women. And then, so I wrote some things, but then I kind of got stalled. And then I started to write again when the Me Too movement happened. And then when COVID hit, I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? Do I include that? Do I not include that? So now I'm finally getting to the place where, I kind of know where I'm going to go with the story. I have to let it I have to ruminate about it in the back of my head for a while. And then, since I published it myself, I'm not on a deadline, which is maybe a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But so I was wondering, what are your favorite genres? I mean, you talked about some, but what are your favorite genres of books?
Oh,
or stories, maybe movies too.
Yeah, well, and I do like movies and I do like TV shows, but I think books are definitely my favorite form of story. And as far as genres, I probably read a little bit of everything. I really do have a deep love for historical fiction. It's funny because what I was reading as a kid, Little House on the Prairie and Nancy Drew, and I would say now historical fiction and mystery are probably my 2 favorite genres. But probably most often what I read is just, your mainstream literary fiction. And it's not so much that I'm looking for a certain genre, but just characters I can connect with and storylines I can connect with. I think the stories that stick with you, I really think it's not necessarily that, and that's why it's so hard for me when somebody says, well, what's the best book you've ever read? What's your favorite book ever? Oh my gosh, I can't just name one. The ones that stick with us the most were, for us, the right story at the right time.
Right.
And, I really think that some of the books that I have just loved and cherished over the years were just because I read whatever connected with me at that particular time. And that's why I rarely go back and reread, because it usually leaves me with this feeling. And when I have gone back and reread years later, it's not the right time for that story for me. And I can still enjoy it, but it doesn't leave me with that same feeling of wonder, So yeah, I like stories with so in addition to the historical and the mystery, I like stories with just very real kind of raw characters that are just so easily relatable. That's, I think, the most important thing for me, regardless of genre. It's got to be believable. What the characters think and do has to be plausible. And that's what will lose me in a story, is if they're not.
So name some that have stuck with you, even though you haven't reread them.
Yeah. So probably the one from earliest in my life, the first one that just really stuck in my brain and embedded itself, was Bridge to Terabithia.
Oh.
Yeah. Because, I'd been reading a lot of the Nancy Drew and the Little House. And, of course, Little House had its fair share of tragedy, but that was a different time and a different world. So, I mean, it was 100 or 150 years ago. So it really wasn't, it might as well be a different planet for me.
Right.
And then I started to read a lot of the contemporary, the Judy Blooms and the Beverly Clearys and people like that. And they were great, but they were generally pretty happy books. Right. And then I remember picking up Bridge to Terabithia, and I was probably in the 5th or 6th grade. And it was, I'm reading through, and here are these contemporary characters, these kids that are about my age, and I relate to them. They're imaginative, their imaginations are so great. And I just love these kids, and I could just be their third best friend, and then it's like out of the blue, just boom, there's this just tragic plot twist. Mm-hmm. And it literally ripped my 10 or 11-year-old soul out. I was reading it on a camping trip, actually. And I remember that moment. And, and it was interesting because I had this, I was so angry at the author for doing this. I was angry at the world because of this tragedy. But I was fascinated, too, because of the, here I was, this young, innocent child. I'd never experienced any major grief in my life, never really lost anybody close, and definitely never lost anybody my own age or very young. And it just was just so heart-wrenching. But I kind of loved that feeling, too.
Yes, I totally understand that.
Yeah. Of just having a story, an imaginative story, fiction, just rip your heart out like that. Yes, it's very hard to describe, but it sounds like you get it. And so that was the first one that just really stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And I think that was what led me toward maybe wanting more real, relatable characters and the raw characters and that kind of stuff. It didn't have to be a happy ending anymore. And maybe that's what gravitated me toward. I really like horror too. And maybe that's what gravitated me toward that too, because I like those feelings of being scared as well. But yeah, that was probably the first one that really, really stuck with me. There were a few others in school. I was very lucky to have had some teachers that assigned some really amazing books. And I know I think it was 7th grade, we read The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin.
Oh, yes. I've only read the first one.
Oh, yeah. I eventually read the whole series, and they were all good, but not, they didn't get me like that first one. And that was really my first foray into like the real fantasy type genre. And then we followed that up in 8th grade by reading The Hobbit. And so I kind of got hooked on that kind of stuff for a while. But I'm not a big series reader, and a trilogy's fine, but beyond a trilogy, I kind of lose patience. So I want to move on. There's too many things to read. So I guess that's probably why I never got seriously into fantasy, because so many of them are such big series. So I've stuck with mainly the trilogies and stuff. But those have really stuck with me through my adult life. A few things that have really hit me. I mentioned I love historical fiction, and I really liked the Middle Ages too. When I was in college, I got a history minor, and I really liked those Middle Ages of study and all that. And so a couple of books that I read on that particular period of time that I think The Name of the Rose was the first one.
Oh, yes.
Such an amazing book, because it had that mystery, and the mystery was so good, but it was set in that old time period. And I probably read that one when I was in college. And I think that might've been what set my love for, those the European Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And then later I read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that one was probably for me one of the right books at the right time, because it has stuck with me. And I've never read the follow-ups.
I think I've only read the second one.
Oh, okay. You didn't read the first?
I read the first one and
the second one.
He has another one that came out last year or something?
Yes, recently. Yeah, within the last year. And, part of it is because I don't want to disappoint. I don't want to lose. I still remember the feeling. I can't remember all the details of Pillars of the Earth, but I still remember that overall feeling I got. Mm-hmm. And, it was another epic with tragedy and unexpected tragedy. I remember having to stop in the middle of that book because I was so angry over and I had to stop and grieve.
I know.
Pick it up again. But I haven't read the follow-ups because I'm just worried that they'll ruin it for me. And
I liked the second one. If I'm remembering correctly, I think the second one, there's a plague. And so that the characters have to deal with, one of the characters has learned she's gone into a convent and she's learned herb craft and healing. And so she's the one who comes up with this for this town. She's the one who's come up with this plan and helps most of the people heal and or not even get the plague.
Okay. I know my husband read it and he said it was really good, but I always planned to, but I just never, I don't know. I was nervous to read it. I need to go back, but I need to reread Pillars of the Earth first.
Yeah. Well, and there's some of the characters are the same and some of them.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. So
are not. But another book that you might, I don't know, you may have read this already. It's called Pope Joan.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
It's one of only like a handful of books that I've read twice. And the reason I read it twice is because my book club group that I was in wanted something and I suggested that and I'm not even sure they read it. Whenever I suggested a book, they never read it. Oh. But it's such a great book about this woman who it takes place, I think, in like the 800s maybe, or 900s. And she and her brother live in Germany, I think, and their father's a priest, and he's quite abusive. And this higher churchman comes through and wants to test his son to see if he can go into the priesthood. Well, he discovers that the daughter is really the one with the brain. Mm. So he talks the father into letting both of them come with him. Mm-hmm. And at some point, the brother dies and she takes his place. She dresses up like a boy. And it's such a fascinating story based on some legends and or actual events of a woman becoming pope. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's a fascinating story.
I've heard good things about it, so I'll definitely have to put that one on my long to be read list.
Oh, I know. Mine's so long too. Yeah, my mother-in-law is the one who suggested that book to me. So that was years ago. It's such a great book. I loved it anyway. And part of the reason I loved it is because it was about not just, in the end, it wasn't just her, but there were other women who dressed up like men and they wanted an education. Well, the only way you could do that was if you were in the priesthood or if you were a nun, which is one of the things about Pillars of the Earth and the sequel is if you want an education, you have to join the church somehow. Mm-hmm. So, do you have any other books that you want to talk about?
A few. So, kind of thinking of, since I've owned the bookstore in the last few years, some of the things that I've loved. And I know one that I read about 3 years ago that has stuck with me ever since. It's probably the best book I've read of the last 5 years, if not a little bit longer, is Lisa C., The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane. I don't know if you've read that one.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah, it's very, very good. It reads like it takes place starting in, I think, the 1990s. but it reads like historical fiction because it takes place in a community in the mountains of China where people are really isolated from civilization.
Oh, yeah.
And it deals with, so it's kind of, I picked it up, it's sort of close to my heart because my own daughter was adopted from China. And this deals with a woman in China who had to put up her baby girl for adoption. And it kind of follows, this woman through her life and coming out of this tiny little village where they grew tea, where they had some very, very old-fashioned type customs and superstitions and all of these things. And so that's why I said it really reads like historical fiction because they just were so isolated from society and technology and just believed these old ways that were just seem very, very odd to us, And then it follows her as the village gets discovered and develops. And then it follows her into the cities of China where she becomes, she gets an education and she becomes a businesswoman. She eventually marries. She eventually moves to the United States. And then it follows this full circle until she finds the daughter that she gave away so many years ago. And there's a little bit of a mystery. She was hidden with the daughter was left with a brick of tea, and that was the clue. And yeah, it's just fascinating book. Very tragic in many ways, very sad. But again, the characters, even though culturally they are so different from anything that I've known personally, they were just so relatable. I just, the main character, I just really connected with her on an emotional level. And so that was a book that has really stuck with me that I've recommended to a lot of people. And it's very good. Of course, Lisa C is just amazing. She would have been at Tucson Festival of Books last year if it had not been canceled. And I was so looking forward to it. But
hopefully
anyway,
they'll have her again.
I know.
And then what's her name again?
Lisa C, S-E-E. Okay. She's written a lot of things. Shanghai Girls, Peony in Love. I should be able, Hummingbird, Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane was, since then she's written Isle of Sea Women, which I have not yet read, but I've heard is really, really, really good. And again, it is about a culture that's sort of undiscovered and unconnected with the more modern cultures around it. That's my understanding about it. So anyway, she writes a lot of that type of thing. She's an Asian American writer. Yeah. And she writes so beautifully. I just really enjoy any of her books. So I recommend her. And then I know I could talk about the most recent one that I read that I really liked that I just finished last week. It's called The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell by Robert Dugoni.
Ooh.
And I mentioned that, sometimes with the books that are a little less well known that these are ones that I want to read myself, to recommend so Robert Dugoni, I guess he writes a detective series that's not really super well known, but, it's not his first book, but it's his first book outside of that genre. And I noticed that I'm on several social media groups for readers to just share, book recommendations and things. And this one kept coming up under a question, what was the best book you read last year or of 2020? And I think it was published in 2018. I noticed it usually takes 2 to 3 years for a book to become big and talked about usually. Mm-hmm. And so many people had mentioned this book and I never even heard of it. I mean, here I'm a bookseller and it's like, what? I haven't heard of this one. And so I picked it up and read it, and it's a coming of age novel, and it's set beginning in the 1960s. Oh. And Sam is the main character, and his name is actually Sam Hill, but his nickname is Sam Hell because he was born with ocular albinism, which is a form of albinism where he does not have the albino characteristics of skin and hair, but he does of eyes. So his eyes are red. And being a Catholic school student in the 1960s, they called him Devil Boy and all of this stuff. And he was bullied and teased. And so it follows his life from those early days and how he connects with basically his two best friends that become best friends lifelong. And just a well-written, heartwarming relatable. He's older than I am. I didn't go to Catholic school, but you can still relate to so much of what he experiences. And, and it follows him through high school to adulthood, his relationship with his parents, his relationship with his friends, his romantic relationships and his high school exploits. And it's just one of those types of books that just left me with such a good feeling and such just refreshing about how, you've got people. He had people in his life that would always be there for him. And it just, I don't know, it's just a refreshing, very good read. And when it comes to recommending this book, and this is a book I look forward to recommending because I think so many different people would like it. A lot of times I'll read a book and I'll think of a couple of specific people. Mm-hmm. This book, they would love this book. But this particular book, I think almost anybody who's a reader can appreciate it. It's just one of those multi-purpose type books.
Well, I'll have to read that one too.
Yeah, it's I recommend it. It's.
So is that one of the things you like about owning a bookstore, is recommending books to people? Or do most people come in and already know what they want?
A little bit of both. I definitely have people who ask me for recommendations, and I love to be able to talk about books. I don't know that I would say I love to recommend because I'm always a little bit nervous. What if they don't like it? Mm-hmm. But I just love to be able to talk about it. And that's really what a recommendation comes down to is, and especially if it's somebody I don't know really well, I don't know their reading history really well, but I'll say, I just read this and it's about, just like I just did. And if it's something that they think they're going to like, it just, and every now and then when somebody comes back to me and says, you recommended this and it was really, really good. And it just is such a great feeling. Yeah.
That's satisfaction.
It really is. It really is. And to think, I nailed it. And because I do have regular customers that I really get to know, and I get to know what they read. And I recommended Sam Hell just about a week ago, and one of my regulars had come in and he said, what do you recommend? And I said, and a lot of times they recommend things and they're like, oh yeah, I've already read it. And I knew this one wasn't well known and hadn't been out a long time. So I recommended it. I didn't even get to say what it was about. He's like, okay, sounds good. If you like it, I know I'll like it.
Yes. Oh, that's so great. I think one of the reasons I don't come into your store very often is, as I said, I don't have room for books on my bookshelves. Right. However, I was wondering, do you belong to, and I cannot remember the name of the organization, where independent bookstores can also sell ebooks? Do you belong to any of those?
Yes, actually, I do both audio and ebooks, both of them. And the audio platform is actually probably a little bit bigger, and I'm doing more sales on it, and it is called Libro.fm.
Oh, that's right.
And it is the same as Audible as far as the deal and the cost, and the books available, very, very similar. It just goes to help independent bookstores. The profits go to independent bookstores, get split among them instead of some big conglomeration. And then the one for ebooks I've started, it's not as big. And I'm a little bit less familiar with it, and I haven't done as many sales on that, but it is called Hummingbird.
Oh.
And so it is out there, and at my website, I do have links to both. So both Hummingbird and Libro FM, and my website is www.getlitbooks.com. So you can find those links there.
Because I wanted to ask you that, what your website was, and because I would like to support your store, but then if I'm going to buy physical books, I usually, like I did in November, I bought physical books for a gift for someone. But I mean, I'm always buying books, and as much as I appreciate the convenience of buying them from Amazon, I have started buying more books from iBooks, Apple iBooks, but I would like to support the local businesses. And so that's why I asked about that. I have only listened to a couple of audio. Well, I take that back. We got some free audiobooks one year, and when we were having a driving trip, and we were listening to audiobooks. A Christmas Carol was one of them. We listened to, I think it was The Time Machine. And then I have listened to Pride and Prejudice narrated by Kate Beckinsale. That was another free one that we got through Apple.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it would be kind of fun to have more audiobooks, which is how my mother-in-law reads 200 and something books
Yeah.
in a year. I'm lucky if I read 50. But so that's great. So I can buy them from you too, and then that supports you.
Yes.
Your
Yes.
bookstore.
And the other thing, so the 2020 and COVID really did kind of push forth a bunch of options for online options for small bookstores. Mm-hmm. And there's another one called bookshop.org.
Oh.
And it is an alternative for people who want to buy physical books, but would rather support independent bookstores but can't make it into a local bookstore.
Right.
So independent bookstores like myself can have links, and this is on my website too, and have links to bookshop.org. And then we get part of the proceeds from that as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I want to support local businesses because you've all been hit so hard.
Yeah, it's been a rough year.
It's not over yet, unfortunately.
No, I know.
Well, I have had so much fun talking to you. Do you have anything else that you would like to recommend or say about your love of books?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, when it comes to books, I could go on forever, so I probably need to stop at some point.
I know what you mean. My sister and niece and I talked about Bridgerton, and we all love period books and dramas on television. And we talked for 2 hours, and it took me 4 days to edit it down to about an hour and 20 minutes. So, oh dear, yeah, we were having so much fun talking about this and this one and this.
Yeah.
And that one.
Yeah.
So yes, well, I appreciate you being on the show. Thank you again.
Okay, sounds great.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. You'll find the show notes for this episode at my website, Sage Woman Chronicles, at sagewoman.life. You can leave a comment there. And remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.